1942, total war. 3 years later, the ultimate weapon brings peace. Soviet Russia and America square off in the Cold War. Southeast Asia becomes a battleground. The Cold War ends with the death of communism. What is the future of war? (1942). Hitler's armies control most of Western Europe. The war that started in Poland moves east. Now they prepare to take the biggest prize of all, the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1942, the Germans penetrated deep into Russia. Their mission, to take Stalingrad, a key industrial city in the Soviet war effort. By September 1942, the Germans had reached the center of Stalingrad. This would be the biggest battle in the history of war. More than 3 million troops clashed as the Red Army faced Germany and her allies. Throughout the autumn, there was bitter street fighting. German tanks were useless in cities. At Stalingrad, territory was won house by house, street by street, only to be lost again, then regained some days later. The human cost of defending Stalingrad was terrible.
We did not think we were suffering then. A terrible war was going on. And each individual wanted to contribute something to the victory we all believed in.
Hitler was determined. He ordered his commanders to take Stalingrad at any cost. But Hitler forgot the lesson learned by Napoleon, the last conqueror who tried to take Russia. The Germans weren't just fighting the Red Army, they were fighting the Russian winter. Half of Napoleon's army had been killed or frozen to death in the disastrous campaign of 1812. On November 19th, the Soviets launched a counterattack. Their pincer movements came from north and south of the city, and in less than a week, they had the Germans surrounded in Stalingrad. Hitler ordered his troops to fight to the death. 800,000 of them did die. On January 31st, 1943, the Germans surrendered. The Russian victory at Stalingrad destroyed the myth of Hitler's invincibility.
Nothing like that had happened to Hitler before, or to the German army, or to Germany. It was a disaster so vast that it couldn't be denied even by the Nazi propaganda machine, and they decided to turn it into a national tragedy.
But it was the Soviets who suffered the worst tragedy. 1,100,000 Soviet soldiers died in defense of Stalingrad.
На каждой станции
You could see from the window
снимали умерших.
that the corpses were not being taken anywhere
И
for
на
burial.
многих станциях прямо из окошка
The winter was very severe,
что их не увозились ранее.
dreadfully severe,
А это была зима, страшная зима.
and the bodies were piled up
Лежали люди
because it was
штабелями.
impossible to bury them in the frozen
Поскольку
soil.
отрыть могилы невозможно было.
They had to wait
Видимо,
for the spring.
ожидали до весны.
Stalingrad was a turning point in World War II. The Soviets proved that Hitler could be beaten. The Allies gained new hope. Germany still controlled most of Europe, but the other great Allied power, America, was laying plans to bring the war to Hitler. The Normandy invasion that began on June 6, 1944, was codenamed Operation Overlord. We remember it as D-Day. 156,000 soldiers would be set down on the beaches of northern France with a mission to liberate Europe. The force comprised a British and Canadian army of 83,000, along with 73,000 Americans. The combined Allied armies were supported by 10,000 airplanes, 804 transport ships, fighting ships, 1,200 of them, 4,126 amphibious landing craft, and hundreds of tanks specially adapted for the beachhead assault. The invasion began with an offshore artillery bombardment. After the German coastal defenses had been softened up, the Allies hit the beaches, driving the Germans back. It was tough fighting, but the invasion was successful. The Germans were on the run. The Normandy invasion was the biggest amphibious assault in history. It was a triumph of military planning. In the summer of 1944, the Allies fought their way from Normandy to regain much of Belgium, Holland, and France. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. For days, the newly liberated French fought street battles in Paris, flushing out the last German resistance. After 4 years of occupation, French reprisals were brutal and swift. Collaborators were beaten to death. Others were publicly humiliated. The Allies began to press eastward toward Berlin. There was hard fighting throughout Western Europe as the Germans threw everything into preserving their conquests. In preparation for the invasion of Germany, the Allies stepped up the war in the air. Day and night, American and British planes attacked German cities. They dropped millions of tons of bombs, They destroyed military targets, but they also bombed whole German cities to rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Nuremberg, Berlin. It was a campaign to demoralize the entire German population and bring the country to its knees. In April 1945, the final battle against the Germans would take place in Berlin. While British, American, and Canadian troops approached from the west, the Soviets were marching from the east. With the memory of Stalingrad still burning, the Soviets advanced on Berlin intent on revenge. On April 25, 1945, the Red Army entered Berlin.
The Battle of Berlin was one of the worst battles of the war. Russians count their casualties in hundreds of thousands in the Battle of Berlin. Because although there was no doubt that they were going to win, the German defenders of Berlin refused to give up resistance.
We fought for every street. There was shooting on every street, and we had to run through the crossfire. The regiment's commander ordered us to take the building on the other side of the street, so we had to cross under fire. And as the commander of the detachment, I had to set an example to my soldiers. So I went first, and they followed me.
Though the war was all but lost, Hitler would not give up. From his Berlin bunker, he commanded his troops to defend the capital of Nazism to the death. The Russian onslaught was merciless.
Although the Germans knew that this was their last battle, they fought tenaciously, and we spilled blood at every step. So many of my friends died, and my closest friend, Slavko Lobov, was shot dead right in front of my eyes.
Orders were issued for the surviving Germans to give up resistance. And the Red Army then proceeded to treat what was left of Berlin as a place of pillage, loot, rape, and murder. A very, very great deal of rape. Tens of thousands of Berlin women were raped by the Red Army in the immediate aftermath of defeat. It seems to have been some sort of primal act of revenge for what the Germans had done on the soil of Russia.
In the east, the war continued. The Japanese fought even more fiercely than the Germans. The Japanese had cut a wide swath of conquest from the borders of India to Australia and controlled many of the Pacific islands. They seemed unstoppable. The Japanese and American fleets battered each other at sea. On the islands, there was brutal hand-to-hand fighting. At a remote research center in New Mexico, the Americans worked on a revolutionary new weapon. No one knew just how destructive it would be. On August 6, 1945, the Americans dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The entire city was destroyed in a flash. 80,000 were killed instantly. No one knows the exact number of those who died later from wounds, burns, and sickness caused by radiation. Perhaps 200,000. A young girl, Michiko Yamoka, was walking in the street half a mile from where the bomb landed.
I thought I was directly hit by the bomb and was dying. When I was rescued, my hair was burnt. My face was inflated like a balloon. I wondered why my shirt had been burnt and hanging around my arms. I soon realized there were pieces of my skin. I saw people looking for water, and they died soon after they drank it.
Three days later, the Americans dropped a second, bigger bomb on the city of Nagasaki. 40,000 died. In September, the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. World War II was over. Now the world knew the price of total war, and an even worse possibility, the threat of nuclear holocaust. In 1945, it wasn't the threat of nuclear holocaust that shocked the world so much as the Holocaust in which 6 million Jews were murdered. When the first Allied soldiers and reporters entered the Nazi death camps at Auschwitz, Dachau, Belsen, Treblinka, the full horror of the German way of war was exposed. The world stared in disbelief. "6 million Jews and other enemies of the state had been killed. Poles, Slavs, dissidents, gypsies, homosexuals, the mentally and physically handicapped. They were worked to death, shot, gassed." The Nazi death camps had been created to exterminate human beings using industrial means and on an industrial scale. In 1945, the Allies set up the first successful international military tribunal to sit in judgment of war criminals, the Nuremberg trials. From ancient Greece until our own time, war has been bound by rules. But in World War II, the rule book was torn up.
I asked you about an order to kill all inmates at Mauthausen concentration camp shortly before the end of the war. Who was responsible for that order? Were you?
Nein.
For the first time in a courtroom anywhere, defendants were indicted and punished for crimes against humanity. But the end of war didn't mean the end of conflict. While the Western Allies and the Soviets had worked together to defeat Hitler, they now eyed each other suspiciously. The Soviets had occupied much of Eastern Europe. The United States and her European allies prepared to combat the spread of communism. This was the beginning of a new war, the Cold War. The front line in the new war was the devastated city of Berlin. Berlin was a patchwork of sectors controlled by the United States, Russia, Britain, and France. To bolster the West against communism, rebuilding Germany was a priority. The Americans helped by backing their new currency, the Deutschmark. When the new money was launched in March 1948, the Soviets saw it as a threat. They blockaded the western sector of Berlin with tanks. Food and essential supplies were cut off. The blockade of Berlin was the first battle of the Cold War. American and British planes began the Berlin airlift to relieve the besieged western half of the city. As the Cold War intensified, citizens of Eastern European countries under Soviet control began to leave for the West. What started as a trickle became an exodus. Between 1948 and 1961, 2.5 million fled East Germany. The Soviets were dismayed that so many Eastern Europeans were voting with their feet by leaving for better conditions in the West. In 1961, they built a concrete wall separating East and West Berlin. Between 1961 and 1989, 5,000 people were captured trying to cross the wall. 191 were killed by East German border guards. The two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, faced each other off, not only in Europe, but across the globe. The whole world became a Cold War battlefield. But for the first time in history, Europe enjoyed half a century without war, even if it was a peace generated from fear. The nuclear arms race created a stockpile of weapons sufficient to destroy the planet many times over. This fearful stalemate was known by the chilling acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. June 1950. Communist North Korea invades South Korea. The United Nations condemns the invasion. It is a first in the history of war, a supranational authority working to ensure peace. The United Nations was formed in 1945 to promote world peace and international cooperation.
Its charter, to which all the victors of 1945 are signatories, actually made war illegal, unless approved by the United Nations or in self-defense. In 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, the United Nations Security Council, from which Russia was temporarily absent, declared the invasion to be an act of aggression and therefore illegal, and called on member states of the UN to send forces to repel the aggression and restore peace, order, and legality. This was not a thing that had ever happened before. I mean, here you had a new world authority saying nations which support the UN as an organization must go to South Korea's assistance.
It was military and material backing from the United States that made the action possible. 14 other countries sent troops. 5 more sent hospital and other support personnel. It was the most diverse Allied force ever. When the UN forces pushed into North Korea, China entered the war in support of her communist neighbor. What started as a small regional conflict threatened to grow into something bigger. It was a devastating war in which 2 million died. After 3 years of fighting, the boundaries between North and South Korea remained the same. They still do today. This was the war which set a precedent for American military efforts to contain communism. America feared that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow. The next big Cold War conflict would be in Vietnam, where once again the communist North would war with the capitalist South.
Dr. Weston Lewis, is that correct? Through the shark gunships? Roger, and the crews have been abstracted from both of those down aircraft. This is Red Dragon 09, right? We'll get help on the way.
I first went to Vietnam in 1967. I was a helicopter pilot. It was exciting. It was an adrenaline rush. I mean, you get a fully loaded, armed helicopter flying as fast as you can in and out of trees and following railroad banks, and the kinds of flying that you did there was simply exciting flying. It was very risky flying, but the mission called for the risk.
It's exhilarating. It's life and death. There's nothing any more exciting than dealing with those situations. Nothing in the corporate world that I've ever done, been a part of in my 25 years as a businessman, even approaches putting it on the line like you did in combat.
Got 2 ships down, one just crashed and burned.
The thing I remember probably most of my first tour was where we went in and medically evacuated 3 infantrymen that had walked into a hedgerow with a booby trap in it. It was not uncommon for the Viet Cong to police up off the field unexploded U.S. artillery rounds and other rounds that were there, and they would booby trap them and use them against us.
I stepped on a 105 millimeter howitzer round, one of our rounds that had been unexploded. They buried it in the ground with a fuse, and I got on it. I knew that something was wrong because debris was raining down all around me. The sound was so loud that it had perforated my eardrums, and it was quiet. There was no noise. I kept trying to get up. And as I looked down to try and get up, I saw that my legs were gone at the knee, completely gone. I was so angry. I recognized that my military career was over, and I thought, what have you done to allow this to happen? And then my next thought was, I just wanted to lay in this hole and die. And I felt resigned, comfortable, and content with that decision. And my third reaction was, no, I want to live. I want to live so badly that whatever the consequences, I accept them now, and I begin to will myself to this process.
When the United States entered the war in Vietnam, it was in the hope of securing a quick victory. The odds were in America's favor. She was the most powerful nation on earth. Vietnam was vastly inferior in wealth and technology. But the North Vietnamese had something America hadn't counted on: dedication to an ideal. In the 18th century, Republican ideals fueled the American Revolution, enabling the colonists to beat Britain. In the 1960s, the North Vietnamese were driven by Marxist ideology and a hatred of colonialism.
Vietnamese are an intensely nationalist people. They'd been subjugated to French rule in the 1870s. They'd frequently rebelled. They'd had 20 years of constant warfare against the French before the Americans arrived in 1965. And by that stage, military experience plus their intense national feeling made their armies very formidable indeed.
They used the old tactics of hit and run that brought success to the armies of the steppe against the Roman Empire and to American colonists against the British. By the end of 1968, more than 30,000 Americans had been killed in Vietnam. As the conflict consumed more and more manpower, young conscripts, many reluctant to be at war, were called up. As the United States became increasingly involved in a war that many Americans didn't support, the anti-war movement gained momentum. The Viet Cong were a frustrating enemy to fight. Young American conscripts found themselves in a deadly war in which they couldn't always tell friend from foe. Morale among soldiers began to deteriorate. And back home in Washington, the political will to win at all costs wasn't unanimous. The resulting confusion had an effect on the battlefield.
By '69, when there was great reservations about how committed they were allowing the military to be to the task at hand, then it began to wear heavily on people's minds to the extent it affected their mission, what they were going to do that day, whether or not they conducted themselves in the way that they were charged.
A conscript army, an unpopular war, a mounting death toll, 57,000 dead. All these factors contributed to America's lack of success in Vietnam.
The units of the American Army in Vietnam were never full of trained men. They were always full of people who just arrived, people who were nearly at the end of their tour, and a minority who were in the middle of their service. It is not a way to run an effective operational army.
Critics of the Vietnam War called it a shameful failure, but America's willingness to fight in Vietnam had a profound effect on her enemies, the Soviet Union in particular.
I think the spectacle of the American superpower being willing to undergo both the military and the social crisis that the war brought about convinced the Russians that it had met an opponent who could not be put down. And whether you regard the strictly military outcome of the Vietnam War as a success or a failure, I think its geopolitical effects were decisive in drawing the Cold War to a close.
Ready!
The Vietnam War also was decisive in how the American military saw itself. It was about to undergo its most radical change since the American Revolution.
Forward! Forward!
This is the most lethal fighting force that ever existed. The United States Army. They call it the Digital Army, a new type of army for a new age. But the model for this army is found in ancient Rome rather than the computer age. It was the Romans who perfected the idea of a strong, war-winning professional army, which made being a soldier an attractive career choice. But a professional standing army had never been part of the American tradition. The American colonists who fought Britain in the 18th century were formed in groups of local militia. America's founding fathers distrusted the idea of a professional standing army. In wartime, America had looked to her citizens to assemble a conscript army. It worked well enough in World War II. But it hadn't in Vietnam. And America's experience in Vietnam was what transformed the United States military.
It brought about a powerful mood of reformation in the American armed forces, a determination by a generation of younger officers not to allow the Army to get ever again as it had gone in the latter stages of the Vietnam War. They wanted a true, professional, regular, full-time army which would perform the will of the United States President in an exemplary fashion, and they got it.
We've gone from an army in which everyone got a draft card and everyone served for a small period of time into an all-professional force, a force of volunteers. What we're trying to do is to take the benefits of accountable, tough, realistic battlefield training, to take the technologies that we now see and to meld those things together now in a model that will allow us to meet whatever the requirements are in 2010, in the 21st century. The centerpiece is information. The ability to move digits of information rapidly about the battlefield, to protect them for our use, to disrupt them from enemy use, to be able to present a picture that'll help answer the questions, where am I, where are my buddies, and where is the enemy, and to do it in real time so that you can have greater tempo, a greater understanding of your environment, and be able to function a lot better.
America was determined and equipped to win the Cold War. But the end of the Cold War happened in a way no one could predict. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Since 1961, it had been a powerful symbol of the divisions between East and West, between capitalism and communism. But it wasn't so much the military strength of the West that brought an end to the Cold War. The communist experiment hadn't worked. 2 years after the Berlin Wall came down, the whole Soviet system collapsed. The end of the Cold War meant an end to the deadly nuclear arms race between America and Russia. It seemed as if the world could breathe more easily. But it wasn't that simple. In 1990, Iraq invaded oil-rich Kuwait. Saddam Hussein's regime had received arms and military assistance from the Soviet Union. Now, with no central power in Moscow to hold him back, Saddam could wage aggressive war.
Paradoxically, in the struggle to restrain rogue states which wish to exercise regional power, perhaps with the long-term intention of exercising power over a much wider area, then I think the old brutal, direct and immediate form of war is not only possible but absolutely necessary. Once the two superpower system collapsed, states which had been under the control of one or the other, and particularly under the control of the Soviet superpower, found that they lost some of the advantages of being under the control of the Soviet state, but they gained the advantages of freedom of action. Those were not advantages for world peace.
In the former Yugoslavia, under the communist leader Marshal Tito, the country's three main ethnic groups, Croats, Serbs, and Muslims, were forced to coexist in a country historically torn by ethnic divisions. With the collapse of communism, war was inevitable. Inevitable because it was a war driven by unfettered ethnic hatred. Between 1991 and 1997, more than 100,000 people were killed. Serbs rounded up Muslims and put them in concentration camps. By 1997, tens of thousands of Muslims had been killed in a campaign of genocide called ethnic cleansing. It was as if Nuremberg had never happened. Empire, whether old-fashioned colonial empire or the ideological empire of Soviet communism, always was a check on regional hatreds. The removal of empire allowed old animosities to come to life again. The most chilling example is Rwanda. In 1994, in the space of a few weeks, 800,000 Tutsis were killed by their Hutu neighbors in a bitter ethnic conflict.
The Hutu were dominated for centuries by the Tutsi, and after Belgian rule was withdrawn, ethnic conflict broke out between them, and repayment of old scores by the Hutu, taking their revenge on their imperial masters, which the Tutsi were. The Hutu undoubtedly conspired to do away with the Tutsi, and 800,000 of them were killed in a very short space of time indeed, largely by hacking and bludgeoning to death, much more than by shooting. It was a blood massacre.
There have been many reasons for war, the oldest being theft, wanting what other people have and taking it by force. Religious belief, Islam and Christianity. Revolutionary political ideas, the American and French revolutions. Political ideologies, communism versus capitalism. But with the end of the Cold War, perhaps the main reason for war today is hatred of one group for another. "5,000 years ago, war began as a form of ritual combat with very little bloodshed. With the rise of ancient Greece, it became the deadly, decisive business of armies. As civilization advanced, wars were fought at greater distance with ever more sophisticated and more lethal weapons. With the coming of the gunpowder age, man's killing power increased. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, it increased beyond imagining. And with the splitting of the atom, science gave man the ultimate weapon, the power to destroy civilization. What is the future of war?
You could say that war has become too costly simply in financial terms. The tax burden of running first-rate armed forces is now enormous. Let's take, for example, an American nuclear aircraft carrier with 100 combat aircraft embarked. The carrier and its aircraft are beginning to approach $20 billion in price. Now, $20 billion is about two-thirds of what Britain spends on its entire defence budget. It's not surprising that only the super-rich countries can afford the full apparatus of war-making. It also introduces another factor. Having paid for it, can you any longer afford to use it? Because you can't afford to lose it. The loss of a single fighter aircraft is a serious financial blow to the treasury, even of a rich country like the United States.
If war has become too costly for rich countries like the United States, then what does it mean for smaller countries?
Take Israel at the beginning of the 1972 war, when it was attacked by Syria. Syrian anti-aircraft fire was so effective that the Israelis started to run out of American-supplied aircraft faster than the Americans were producing them in the factories in the United States. So, in fact, a small war in Israel was actually overstraining the American defense industry. That's, I think, an example of how expensive, high-intensity operations can be in the modern age.
But most wars aren't high intensity, like Israel's war with Syria or the Gulf War. Most conflicts in the post-Cold War period are low-intensity wars, fought with small arms. How is their cost measured?
Unfortunately, low-intensity operations of the sort that we've seen so much of in Africa. These awful scenes of low-level but relentless killing between tribal and ethnic factions isn't particularly expensive because they're cheap weapons that they're using. It's extraordinary to think that most of the casualties suffered since the Second World War have died as the result of second-hand small arms. It's said that there are 50 million second-hand Kalashnikov assault rifles in the world, which can be bought for $50 each. Anybody can afford them. So you have this extraordinary disparity that high-intensity operations are almost unbearably expensive, whereas low-intensity operations are all too affordable.
The cost of war can't only be measured in terms of money. In the 20th century, more than 100 million people were killed because of war. That is greater than the total dead in all wars since the beginning of recorded history.
The human costs of war, particularly as it's come on towards the end of the century, rise and rise. The ability of the individual to kill other individuals has been multiplied by the appearance of all sorts of handheld weapons. This means that killing in war can get completely unbearable in its effects. And this affronts human feeling. It also, through the effect of the mass media, affronts collective opinion. The combination means that we've come to regard warfare at the end of the 20th century as unbearable because of its cost in human life.
The irony is, for peace to stand a chance, strong armies of responsible powers are needed to police it. The role of armies in democratic nations has changed dramatically. Their main purpose is no longer to make war, but to keep peace. And sometimes to make peace.
You can make peace in a whole variety of ways, sometimes very bloody and brutal ways indeed, and I don't think that the United States Army or the British Army or the French Army are committed to making peace with a sort of loss of life that went on in the Second World War. But they are both peacemaking and peacekeeping, and that is a real change.
We'll have to be able to conduct offensive operations against a belligerent that wants to fight. We'll have to be able to conduct defensive operations of our interests wherever our civilian leadership asks us to go, against belligerents that might want to fight. We'll have to be able to be effective in a stability role in creating conditions for stability where there's unrest. And finally, I think we'll have to be relevant in support roles to offer our help and assistance in ways that might not require our fighting.
The future is always uncertain. Historians have no crystal ball to help us figure out what to do. But the history of war and civilization can help us make rational and peaceful decisions for the future. After a lifetime's thinking on the subject, John Keegan believes we have only two choices.
War can take two paths from this point onwards. It may revert to the pattern of mass warfare that we saw in the first half of the century, in which there will inevitably be a resort to the use of nuclear weapons and the end of civilization. Or it may persist down the track which is perceptible since the end of the Cold War, where international authority brings multinational force to bear on local quarrels, regional quarrels, restrains them, contains them, and with optimism, let us hope, ultimately eliminates them. I think we must be optimistic, because if we're not optimistic, the alternative is bitter pessimism.